The Athletic.
The race is on, and Max Verstappen was back to winning ways at Imola, but what looked like a relatively straightforward win became a tense finish as Lando Norris got close late on. But was this just Red Bull playing it cool, or is this another sign that the 2024 season is getting a lot more lively? I'm Ed Straw, and joining us to tell it like it is are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Mark Hughes. Scott, we'll say hello to you first. You've been following this weekend in great detail remotely, because, as we know, we don't let you come to Imola or the race gets cancelled. So, how much did you enjoy it from afar? It's still an iconic venue, even when you're not here.
It's I love seeing the cars on this track. I know it's not. I know it's a bit of a mismatch in terms of where the circuit comes from and kind of what it's evolved into or what it hasn't evolved into, and what these behemoth racing cars have evolved into. So yeah, there's a mismatch there. It doesn't always lend itself to the best racing, but just even through practice and especially qualifying, there's just something about it. I love the changes that have been made since last year with the gravel trap closer to the circuit in several key parts. It's a massive challenge. So yeah, really, really good. I was even surprised that we had a fun finish to the race, as I was lamenting how dull it was for large portions. But the absolute favourite bit about doing this race remotely is, unlike the two of you, I haven't had to deal with the horrific traffic and organisation around this event.
Yes, it has been a little bit trafficky, and the signposting hasn't been great. How have you found the getting in and out overall, Mark?
Yeah, it was a little bit sticky in the town of Imola itself until we realised that the GPS insisting that the mountain pass that we often use was closed, was actually only closed to non-pass holders by a teenager holding his hand up. So once we realised that, we came in the usual way and we had our pass, so we're okay.
Yeah, I was coming from a slightly different direction. It was a little bit harder, but it is something that frustrates me a little bit still with Formula 1. I know I've moaned about this before. Obviously, Imola isn't great for a massive event in terms of people coming in, so you accept that, but they're really bad on the signposting still. This is a Liberty Media era F1 thing. The signposting's awful.
Yeah, it's the last year. I think, I don't know how much is Liberty and how much is FIA, but I know that there used to be the photographer's representative always used to make sure that all the signs were there from a long way out. So anybody that had not been here before was trying to find it for the first time would have struggled a bit. But anyway, these are first world problems, aren't they? Shall we talk about the race?
I have one other thing though. Didn't you guys also get relegated to the to the shed on the other side of the circuit instead of the proper media centre?
Yes, we're in a porta cabin, and the proper media centre is now part of the hospitality.
Sign of the times.
Yeah, we won't complain about that too much, because people will just blame us for quite rightly for very much first world problems there. But yes, it's a bit of a cramped race, but overall it's still great to be at Imola, and I hope Imola stays on the calendar. I hope they sharpen up a few areas of organisation. But Mark, let's talk about the race rather than those first world problems. The usual question: how did it all play out?
Well, for the first 3/4 of the race, let's say, it looked like a perfectly routine Red Bull Max Verstappen performance, didn't it? He built up a cushion, took pole, won the start, built up a nice, comfortable cushion that prevented him from being undercut, came in, put the new tyres on, and with only one stop, that looked to be it. And for about half of that second stint, he kept that gap at around 6 seconds, so it looked like really routine. But then something quite dramatic happened. He lost all the temperature in his front tyres. And basically this was a run-on from all the setup problems that they'd had on Friday. So they'd essentially taken an untested setup into the race, because the one that they had on Friday was disastrous, and that just wouldn't have worked. So yes, he'd said after taking pole, well, yeah, it's good, the car feels a lot better than it did on Friday, but I have no idea what it's going to do in the race. And we found out it basically the front tyres ran out of tread, and once they do that, they start losing temperature quite rapidly. And all Max was feeling was, the car was no longer turning in, so he was trying to be gentle on the tyres, which was actually the worst thing he could have done in the circumstances. But once, with like thin tread, once it gets too cold, you can't wake it back up again. So that was it. So he was just having now to sort of just cope as best he could with that balance and concentrate on getting the exits right and trying to make sure that Norris did not get within that second of that DRS detection point in the last few laps. And he employed various means of doing that. He was being very clever with how he used his battery until there was almost no battery left, and then he had to go to a different mode, which meant the engine was clipping, so he had to sort of redefine what was the best way of doing the lap defensively with that. And then there was one particular moment, I think 2 laps from the end, when Norris was really looking like he was going to get within that detection point gap, and with a little bit of judicious early braking from Max, forcing Lando to brake early and thereby lose the momentum, he averted that little bit of crisis. And so, so it looked for a while as though Max had got it stabilised regarding the tyres, but then, when the clipping moment came, then Lando came back, so it sort of lit up again the contest, and it kept us all on our toes until the end. But I think it does illustrate, yes, Red Bull had the overall strongest package here, but it does illustrate that the others are now close enough that when it has an off day, they are in trouble, and it was a bit of a dogfight from the beginning of Friday right until the checkered flag.
And Scott, was there a point where you thought that this might turn into either a McLaren win or Verstappen just holds him off by a few thousandths over the line?
Yeah, it was once we got into the last sort of half a dozen laps or so, I think, or just before that, when the gap was not just coming down by between half a second and a second a lap, but once it had been slashed away at for several laps and was about half of what it was originally. So I think once he got to around 3 seconds, just under 3 seconds behind, you saw that it was sustainable. There wasn't any coming back from Verstappen's point of view in terms of the pace, or it didn't look like that anyway. Norris's speed didn't look like it was abating, and there were enough laps left. So it felt like it just felt like he would at the very least get within DRS range by the flag. And that's exactly what happened. It's just a shame. It's a shame for Norris, but just purely from a visual point of view, because it would have been fascinating to see them go properly wheel to wheel for the win, that he didn't get into DRS range a lap or two earlier, because then that would have put a bit more pressure on Max. It would have potentially opened the door for one or two kind of like little looks into turn one. You just don't know where it goes from there. But Max, as Mark was just explaining, did a good enough job to just keep him at arm's length, really, and only let him get into DRS range when it didn't matter.
Yeah, I think it's worth talking about the quality of performance from Max, because sometimes it's been a little bit straightforward, but this was one of those weekends where he could very, very easily have not won the race. Look at how Checo Perez ended up. He could have not been on pole, he could have not won the race, but he did, because he delivered at a very high level all the time while winning a 24-hour race, race in the background
in
as
his
well.
spare time. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. He knows how to win a race. He knows how to deliver a performance, and he delivers at the big pressure moments, such as the pole lap. And it was a bit scrappy, and he got a bit of help from his mate Nico Hülkenberg, but it was still enough. And he controlled that first stint on the mediums remarkably well, and it turned out the hard was a bit of a trickier tyre than everyone had assumed. So it went from there.
And if you have a look at or listen to how Verstappen reacted to it, basically over the finish line, over the team radio, the actual message got censored, obviously, because he swore, basically. But there was not only a note of obvious celebration and happiness in his voice as he was sort of cheering down the radio to his team and his race engineer. There was some relief in there, but there was just a real sincerity to every emotion. Like it was so different to the other wins. Like, he's won so many times, but it was the same after qualifying, and it was the same after the race. We've heard plenty of times, not just Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton did it loads as well, where drivers who often get these results, it's not that they make out like it's harder than it is, but they're kind of having to sell how hard it is because it doesn't look that hard from the outside. But this was one where there was no overplaying it whatsoever. There was no need to overplay it. It was just a total like uninhibited expression of, oh, that was so difficult and I actually did it. I can't believe we did it. And that was after qualifying and after the race. So I think this one was really sweet for Verstappen. I think he relished both results to a degree that is unusual because it was properly hard work.
And especially coming on a track where there's so little margin for error, when you're really pushing on, you have to be precise. Mark, we've got a few questions from the Race Members Club we'll address here because they clear up a few points in the battle at the front. So we'll run through a few here, and I might throw one at Scott in a moment as well. But the first one comes from Luke Kelly, who says, if Lando Norris turned up the pace a few laps earlier, is it likely in hindsight he could have bridged the gap, or would the tyres have degraded? And if Lando did not go wide when he was around 1.7 seconds behind Max, is it likely he could have caught Max before the end of the race?
In an ideal world, yes, but if he'd not had that restraint early in the second stint, there's every chance he was going to get attacked by Leclerc, and that would have cost him more time than the restraint cost him, almost certainly. And also the Larry moment that he had that cost him the time was a result of pushing so hard on the tyres to catch Max. So one doesn't come without the other. So it's just you have to take it all in the round.
And the next question comes from Joe Graham, who says, how costly was the decision by McLaren to let Norris spend a lap behind Sergio Perez by pitting him when they did? And Sebastian Stolzer asked a very similar question about whether Perez was instrumental in Norris not winning.
I think that he did lose a little bit of time behind Perez, and who knows whether that might have made a difference. But if you go back to when the decision had to be made, they were more or less forced into that decision because of where Leclerc was. If they hadn't come in, Leclerc would probably have undercut them. And, you know, you would then say, well, you know, Leclerc would have had track position over them, and you would then have said, did that time stuck behind Perez before Leclerc got past, cost him the victory? So it was that close. You can't have your cake and eat it sort of thing. So it was necessary to pit him when he did to prevent the undercut from Leclerc, and that cost some time, but maybe not the critical time.
Question I'll throw at you, Scott, now from Joanne Juice, who said, what could Oscar Piastri have achieved had he started on the front row? And Michael Harris, on a similar note, asks if this was an unfortunate missed opportunity for Piastri.
There was definitely a missed opportunity here because I think such is the nature of this circuit and so fine were the margins between those top three teams, really, that where you started was a significant factor in where you finished. And it was very much a case of between McLaren and Ferrari that I don't think either car was really going to overtake the other on track. With Piastri, his performance deserved that front row start, and I suspect his opening stint would have gone much the same way as Norris's. He would have gradually slipped back a bit from Verstappen, and he would have been under a bit of pressure from, well, his teammate Norris and also Leclerc's Ferrari for a while. Based on how the second stint played out, I haven't actually seen what Piastri said after the race, so maybe one of you two can clear this up if I've got this wrong. But it looked to me like, unfortunately, another case of Piastri just missing a little bit when it comes to the management side of things. It felt like he'd pushed the hard a little bit too much in the first part of the stint and then kind of faded a little.
He had to push hard on the outlap to make the undercut work on Sainz, and when you do that, you know, that usually means you're going to have much heavier deg than a car which hasn't done that. So yeah, I think it was only that because as you say, in the first stint he was stuck behind Sainz, but I don't think he was having any trouble managing the tyres generically this weekend. I think it was just the undercut manoeuvre.
Yeah, and Piastri was asked what was missing after the race, just in terms of not getting a podium. He just said it was just starting further back, and then he got into the situation with the tyres, etc. But it just all came from that three-place grid penalty he had. He had qualified second. He'd impeded Kevin Magnussen, and it was a fair penalty, but it wasn't Piastri's fault, that penalty. The stewards did say he was warned too late, and actually Piastri did a pretty good job to mitigate it once he knew Magnussen was there, but it was far too late a warning, far later than others were getting, and so that impeding, I don't feel, counts against Piastri. It was McLaren's error, not his.
I agree, and the main thing is, Mark was obviously alluding to it there, but with it's worth probably reiterating that when you use the tyre in that way at the start, it's not just a case of you use a bit more of the tyre at the start and therefore like you have a bit less to manage over the rest of the stint as well. It's just I don't know. It's an oversimplified way of saying it, but it damages and uses the tyre in a way that means that the tyre then gets exponentially worse through the stint. It's an escalation.
You've got the most tread, so you've got the most tread, you've got the most movements, so that plays a part in it. So there's a wider chemical process. There's a number of things. So yeah, you're always better off if you bring it in gently.
Yeah, exactly. So obviously circumstance dictated it. You'd probably have to look back, wouldn't you, and see, could actually in hindsight, could Piastri have been slightly gentler on that outlap and still undercut Sainz? You won't know that unless you review the data absolutely intensely. But I think he would have been. I think he would have absolutely been on the podium had he started on the front row. Obviously, jury's out on whether or not he'd have kept Norris at bay. I think Norris's stint on the hards was really, really strong. So that could easily have been something that Norris came at him in the second half of the second stint and got past him. But I think if you look at the gap between Leclerc and Norris in the end, I think if Piastri starts that race in front of the Ferrari, he finishes in front of the Ferrari.
Yeah, and he could well have started in front of Verstappen had he not had the impeding thing, and had he got a little bit more pace on the lap. There was a mistake in Ravazza 2, just a little snap. It cost him about 10th and a half, something like that, maybe a tiny bit more. So he could have started ahead, and if he'd started ahead, who knows what would have happened. We've already anticipated most of this question from William Jenner, Mark, but it's about whether Piastri was rougher on his tyres compared to Norris. We've addressed that and said, or did his battles with the Ferraris play more of a factor in hurting his overall pace? That was the fundamental thing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
He was put into a battle with Ferraris he shouldn't have been having.
That he wouldn't have been in had everything went more smoothly. Yes, exactly that.
Exactly. Well, we got ahead on answering that question mostly. But I guess finally, Scott, we should be pretty impressed with McLaren. Now, this is a track that can work quite well for McLaren, so I don't think it means McLaren are going to be at this level week in, week out, but it's really positive for the season, isn't it, that Red Bull can be put under pressure, that McLaren's strong, Ferrari not far behind. So this season that was looking like a walkover is getting quite interesting.
Yeah, I remember back in pre-season testing when some of the talk about the Red Bull was that the gap was even bigger than it was last year, and there were certainly some hints, weren't there, in the opening races that when this car is in the groove and it's on a circuit that plays to its strengths, you've got absolute walkover from Verstappen and 1-2s with Perez as well. So there was some real pessimism about the season, and with things like Hamilton's move to Ferrari and other bits and bobs, I remember there being quite a strong narrative within the paddock at the first 2 or 3 events of feels like everyone's just kind of counting down the days to 25 or even 26. But I don't think we should wish away this season at all. I think it could get quite fascinating. I don't think Ferrari's too far off either. What McLaren's offering at the moment is clear evidence that on tracks that they can get the most out of that car, and especially when the Red Bull's vulnerable, there's a chance to win. But I honestly think we're at a point now where circuit characteristics suiting or not suiting a car, that is perfectly within just the normal range of what decides a Grand Prix weekend. That's not a team being unlucky or lucky or whatever. So I think the main thing is that I don't think it just requires Red Bull to slip up now. I think within the scope of what is quote-unquote acceptable for circuit characteristics or weekend circumstances or conditions or whatever, suiting one car more than the other, I think it's close enough now for that to swing it. So that's a quote-unquote normal weekend, exactly like this one, where Red Bull is vulnerable and under pressure. And we weren't saying that a few races ago, so I think that is really interesting.
Exactly, and it's great when you've got Norris on good form. Piastri, he's had a few ups and downs this season. He maybe hasn't been able to show what he can do as often as he'd like to have done, but he's showing he's absolutely someone who can be there to win when those opportunities present themselves. Right, Scott, let's get on to Ferrari now, because there was excitement coming into the weekend about their first significant upgrade of the season, promising long-run pace on Friday as well, but very much third place in terms of pace in the car pecking order, with Leclerc third and Carlos Sainz fifth. What's your read on their progress or lack thereof?
I think they have made progress. I think if you look at what McLaren gained with that Miami upgrade, and then I think we saw more of that here, including the fact, I think, as you were hearing from Andrea Stella, that the McLaren upgrades basically become more powerful as they see it on a circuit like this where it gives the drivers more confidence. That's an intangible gain. That's something you don't measure on a simulator. So the McLaren upgrades really moved that team along. Red Bull brought some stuff here as well, so the goalposts had moved in terms of the best team. And yet Ferrari, I think, was just inside its seasonal average in terms of qualifying performance and wasn't really missing that much in the race. So it has brought something. It has brought a reasonable amount. It wasn't ever going to be a massive game changer. That's what team boss Fred Vasseur said, and Sainz wasn't particularly happy at some of the numbers he'd heard or seen being attributed to what the upgrade was supposed to have been worth pre-weekend. So I think it got talked up a bit too much. We actually discussed this, didn't we, Ed, on the preview podcast about how it had been overplayed and overhyped a little. And I think Ferrari were quite keen to kind of correct that going into the weekend already. So I think where it's ended up is that Ferrari is probably third best in qualifying because it doesn't seem to be quite as strong a Saturday car, and that's it hurting it at the moment because it does seem to have quite a strong Sunday car. And like I said earlier in another answer, track position's really important. Where you started pretty much determined where you finished, and Leclerc in particular felt that if he'd started on the front row or in the lead, he could have won that race. But as it was, he started back because of qualifying, and he's finished where he started.
Yeah, there's also an element of circuit specific to it as well. I believe Imola, Ferrari were privately saying this is not a good track for us, and it's to do with the unusual configuration of its power unit. Actually, it has a small, very responsive turbo, long inlet tracks, which gives a great acceleration and response at low speeds. But it runs out of puff higher up, and you sometimes have to counter that with less than your optimal aero setup. So any circuit like this, which is relying on your like coming out of Ravazza 1 and Ravazza 2 strongly, and then you'd get part of the way down the straight, and it starts to tail off. Then the further you get down, the further you'll tail off. So I think it's more that. I think we will see this power unit to its in its best light at Monaco, and we've seen that over the years. Even when the car wasn't particularly competitive, it was always with this power unit very competitive around that particular track, and I think we'll see that again the next weekend. So this, even though wasn't a great track for it, it was they were still able to put pressure on McLaren and be not that far away from the winning car. So I think they can be encouraged by this.
And that's illustrating a point of what we want to get to, where we've got 2 teams, 3 teams, ideally 4 or 5 teams, all very close on average performance, and then you get the swings of the circuit, specific characteristics and execution. That's a recipe for something really, really fantastic, and we know that all 3 of those top teams have got drivers who can put on a great show within that, so maybe we're inching towards that. But Mark, Mercedes didn't have too bad a weekend, an upgrade that seemed to work as expected. Hamilton finishing 6th ahead of George Russell after the latter stopped late on to bag an extra point for the team for fastest lap. How would you evaluate their weekend?
They were about as far off as they usually are, but with let's say a sanitary balance, a car that lacked outright performance, but which could be balanced, and the drivers didn't mind how it was driving. It was flattered a little bit by the problems Aston Martin had probably, so put it in this no man's land behind the top 3 teams, but well ahead of everybody else, ahead of Aston Martin and RB and Haas, what have you. So they did their race in that no man's land, and they bagged the result. It was no more, no less than that, really.
Yeah, and there's a feeling that they're at least making some progress now. It's rather than being these full storms, just making a bit of steady progress. They know they've got to do a lot more to get to where they want to be able to have a car that's strong in the high speed and low speed at the same time rather than one or the other. But they're positive about the fact they think the fundamentals of the car are fine. there's no hard points they need to change for next year. That's what James Allison said on Friday when I asked him about that in the press conference. So it's all about that kind of aero development and just making sure everything's right with the aero concept, the stuff you can adjust within the hard points. So that's sort of gently encouraging for Mercedes. And George Russell executed a pretty good weekend. Obviously, although he finished behind, he effectively was ahead of Hamilton. And in terms of performance, Scott, Aston Martin's Lance Stroll was 9th, ahead of RB's Yuki Tsunoda. Once again, not many points left on the table by the big teams, but this was perhaps the most interesting area of the race, given Stroll ran long and made gains. Tsunoda was an early stopper. Obviously, Hülkenberg was in the points initially as well. So how happy should RB and Aston Martin be?
It's difficult to say, really, because based on how the season has gone so far, a 9th place for Stroll and Tsunoda being the one that nicks a point is a pretty good result for both of them, to be honest. And I think it's something that they wouldn't be too disappointed with. But I think given the fact that Aston Martin had an upgrade that numerically dwarfed any other at Imola, now in terms of the visible aspect of it, the size of it, in terms of actually how big the upgrade was and what it was meant to be worth, obviously only the teams know sort of what they're expecting and how they would quantify it. But just in terms of the number of new parts that each team declared, Aston's was the biggest, and it seemed to make no difference. Now, obviously, as I was saying before, with so many other teams introducing upgrades, obviously that does move the goalposts a little bit. So if everybody does a really good job, then the competitive picture can look the same as it did a couple of races ago, even if Aston's done a really good job with that upgrade. But given it looked a bit difficult at times and Alonso had a particularly disastrous weekend, it wasn't utterly abysmal, not like a couple of the weekends towards the end of last year when they introduced upgrades that seemed to get them a little bit lost. But it did have a tiny bit of the air of that, in that there just wasn't that introduce the upgrade and bam, they make a big step forward. You know, it wasn't McLaren-esque or anything. So I think to only be 9th and to have to recover to salvage 9th is disappointing. And as for Tsunoda, yeah, grabbing a point is something decent for RB in that midfield fight. But given where he was running at different points of the weekend, you know, showing like top 6 pace a lot of the sessions, for that to have dwindled to where it did in qualifying, I think he started 7th. And then I think RB just got outgunned in the race, so just sort of slipped back, and then obviously Stroll's strategy jumped him as well. It just felt like an underwhelming end to a weekend that had promised a bit more earlier on.
Yeah, and Tsunoda again doing a good job though. Personally, he's on a nice consistent run of form. Had the edge on Daniel Ricciardo again, and the Daniel Ricciardo saga continues to go on, doesn't it? You have these positive moments, and then perhaps a few more negative moments, and he seems to have a few question marks about the progress. And yeah, Nico Hülkenberg, as we said, finished 11th because he did run in the points after a mega qualifying performance again, but the Haas wasn't quite quick enough. He got undercut by Tsunoda, didn't he? Then he was jumped and overcut by Perez and Stroll, so that shuffled him down to 11th, head of Ricciardo with Magnussen 13th. But Williams, Mark, a pointless weekend for them, literally and metaphorically, you'd probably say. Alex Albon retired because there was no point continuing after losing a load of ground to a loose wheel at its first pit stop. Logan Sargent was 17th. What do you make of that extraordinary admission that the car has been losing 0.450 seconds per lap thanks to being overweight prior to bringing an upgrade to Imola that started to tackle that, at least on Albon's car, because he had the new floor?
Yeah, if you subtract 4.5 tenths from its qualifying performances throughout the season, it's got a very different looking season than the one it has. So yeah, I mean, it's all part of this reorganisation of how they manufacture the car and the modernisation of the processes, and they tackled that with the chassis. Ironically, it was in making a lightweight chassis and how long it took to do that, because it was manufactured in a very different way. 14
kilos lighter than last year's chassis, the actual monocoque.
Yeah. That made them, that delayed, you know, everything else. And when you are stuck for time in producing the pieces, the bodywork pieces, and some of the mechanical pieces also, the fastest way to do it is to make them slightly overweight, because you don't have to do such detailed finite element analysis to minimise the weight. So missing that stage out piled the weight back on and more from what they'd they'd saved on the chassis. So it's all there to be had as they get on with the programme, but of course it's been delayed by the various accidents in the early races. But it'd be interesting to see what a fully lightened Williams actually goes like later in the season.
Yeah, it wouldn't take too much of a swing for them to be proper points contenders. And yeah, Alex Albon was accentuating the positives gently. I think that he's a bit frustrated at the fact the season started badly, and obviously they can see all the long-term positives and the medium-term positives, but I think he thinks it's not going to be too long before they can be in a position to do something. We did have quite an amusing moment after the race, because I was over at the media pen, so the drivers come over to us, so walked over, and we were watching like the last couple of laps, and I think there were about 3 journalists standing there, and the drivers come up to us, and we completely failed to notice Alex Albon just coming up to us and standing in front of us. So, sorry, I noticed you there. It's because we were all busy watching the denouement. To be fair, he was watching it as well at the same time, so we were we were half listening to him, he was half listening to what he was saying, because we were keeping an eye on that. But it was just a funny little moment, because normally you're waiting for them, it's just like, oh, go away, there's something happening, and he probably thought the same about us.
He's also absolutely the kind of driver that would arrive and then would just be very, very polite about it.
Massively so, yeah.
Just kind of just like, I'm ready when you are. Just we'll take no, guys, don't worry, take your time. But I know exactly what you mean about, like, he's kind of watching it while you're talking to him, because it happens in qualifying as well. Because obviously we get the drivers in Q1 and especially the drivers from Q1 as Q2 still going on, and sometimes the Q2 drivers when Q3 is finishing, and there's a mix. Some drivers pause between speaking to TV and speaking to us or whatever to watch a little bit on the on the screens in the pen, and then they walk round to the next bit. Or when they're with us, you occasionally see it sometimes on TV, but it's easy with us because they're not on camera, so they know they can get away with it. You watch them and they're in front of you, and like they're talking, but they're just not looking at you. Like they're just looking at the screen. And Albon's actually one of the better ones at managing to kind of coherently get his point across while he's absolutely not paying attention. Or he will just stop for a bit, and then he will just pick up exactly where he left off 60 seconds before or something, before he watched the end of that final lap.
No, he's very good and very professional, Albon, and yeah, everyone wanted to watch that. That finish, it's just an amusing little moment at the end of the race. But yeah, lots of work to be done for Williams. I won't say much about Alpine because they just weren't very quick. Pierre Gasly showing signs of getting his head round the car, though. I think he was underlying pace a bit quicker than Ocon this weekend. It didn't show because he messed up his last qualifying run braking for Ravazza 1 as he went past Sainz. He held his hand up for that and then ended up on a different strategy. And Sauber were just nowhere this weekend, floor upgrade, but yeah, just not much pace in the car. Although apparently they fixed their pit stops. I haven't looked closely at the pit stops they did during the race, but there were no replays. Chevy Pugilar, the head of trackside engineering, said that they've made some progress there. So yeah, maybe in future races we'll see a bit more from those two teams. Right, it's that time in the podcast when we answer your questions about the race. Thanks to everyone in the Race Members Club who sends those questions in. We really do appreciate it, and we try to get to as many as possible and usually answer most of them across this episode and the ones that follow before the next race. So for more information, check out our website and the episode description for this podcast for links and to understand more about the Members Club. And apologies to anybody whose questions we don't get to over the next couple of podcasts. First up for you, Mark, from Ben Hawkes. The RB20 has not looked as dominant so far this season as its predecessor. Is this because the other teams are catching up, or is it proving difficult to get into its operating window, meaning it's more susceptible to being beaten in a Grand Prix?
No, I think it's more the former, Ben. I think you saw several races last year where they had a bit of trouble getting the car dialed in, but it didn't really matter. It just reduced the size of their advantage rather than the fact that they had one. Whereas I think now McLaren and Ferrari are actually close enough that when you have when Red Bull has a bit of an iffy weekend and it's a little bit tricky to dial in, and it usually happens actually at circuits that demand a high ride height, which this is one of them, and yeah, then you can see them they're a little bit vulnerable, but I do think it's mainly due to the progress of McLaren in particular, but also Ferrari.
Next question for you, Scott, from Kieran Bruce, who says, with many teams having significant upgrades, does this result give a representative performance for the rest of the season?
It would be interesting if it did, because I'd quite like every race from now to the end of the season to be decided by less than a second and unknown onto the final lap. In terms of the team-to-team performance, the pecking order, I don't think so. I think there's enough scope already, even if the cars didn't change between now and the end of the year. There's enough. There's such a small margin and so many different variables at play that the order would still change weekend to weekend. I think you'd have some weekends where Ferrari is chasing Red Bull the closest, and I think you might even have one or two weekends where McLaren gets pole, and then one or two weekends where the Ferrari's on pole, and there would be legitimate opportunities to beat Red Bull on outright pace. I think it is that close at the moment, and there are different strengths and weaknesses to each package. When you then throw in the fact that there are more upgrades to come, and that there are different, presumably different levels of potential within each package. Now, obviously, Red Bull did change the car considerably for this season, so I don't think it's hit its ceiling. But Jock Clear put it quite nicely, didn't he, Ed, on Friday morning, when he said that he just doesn't think that these regulations are such that they eradicate the possibility of someone finding some kind of game changer development. So if any of the teams, if Ferrari or McLaren does that, or even one of the chasing teams, Mercedes, even Aston Martin, then that becomes quite interesting. So I think there's loads of scope for this to change. I'd be surprised if this was the pecking order from now to the end of the year.
A question I'll take now from John Fellingham, who says, given that Red Bull were nowhere on Friday, but thanks to 11 hours of sim work are back in their usual position, should F1 ban sim work during an F1 weekend so that it's down to the track team to chase the setup? Well, you can make a case for it. I can see there's a bit of an old world appeal to it, just purely being about the team trackside to doing it, but at the same time it is pretty impressive what the teams can do in terms of the work at the factory. I think it's also worth noting that when we talk about simulator work, normally that's shorthand for driver in loop simulator, but simulators are everything. It's driver in the loop simulator, it's hardware in the loop simulator, it's completely digital simulations, it's just myriad tools that can be used, so it'd be very difficult to police as well.
Yeah, and I think you can turn it the other way around and say, if you banned it and Red Bull turn up at a circuit with the perfect setup, which they quite often do, and McLaren, for example, has a lot of potential but have missed the window, you've banned them from competing. So it could just as easily work against closer performance as the opposite.
Yeah, that's a very, very valid point. I think it's something that F1, if they wanted to look at it in terms of making teams a bit smaller, saving money, that kind of thing, perhaps, and it would have an impact on race weekends, but I think Mark's right in that it'll probably be a bit swings and roundabouts.
And obviously, as we found out this weekend from his 24-hour race exploits, Max has got a full sim set up in his motorhome, so he would just do it himself if they banned it. He'd have some kind of sim set up going on, and he'd just do his own testing back in the evening.
Yeah, and he's clearly got the time to do it as well, so it's fine.
Exactly.
I think he pretty much won that race almost as the race was starting, the Grand Prix here, wasn't it? It was
just before. It was just before. So he'd won a race before he'd even started his race, which, even by Verstappen's domination standards, that's pretty impressive.
It was a Nürburgring 24 hours, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
The sim race, brilliant. That's what we like to see. That's proper enthusiasm. Mark, a question for you from your first namesake, at least, Mark Martin, who says, this was possibly the worst performance I've ever seen from Alonso. What were the predominant reasons for this? Was it related to the updates?
Don't know if it was related to the updates, but it was certainly related to the Aston being so difficult and so bad, and Alonso's refusal to accept the limitations of the car. So I'm repeatedly going off. I think he went off a total of 4 times this weekend. He did some damage, which further compromised him, of course, and he just got into this vicious circle, really, of downward performance. So, I quite often make the point that a driver's performance is not independent of the car. There's a false ceiling put on what a driver can do if the car's not working the way he needs it to work, and that applies here. You can't compare a driver's performance in a car that's just not working to a driver in a car which is perfectly balanced and allows him to access the stuff he's good at. So it's you're not comparing like with like. So. I'm always reluctant to really rate drivers independent of their car.
Yeah, that's always the challenge that I get lumbered with. But yeah, it was Saturday that really undid Alonso ultimately. I think if Saturday had gone okay and he hadn't had the crash and then he hadn't had the hasty rebuild and hadn't had the fuel thing that stopped him maybe having one more lap in Q1, it could have been very different, and he'd have been up there in the lower part of the points, which just seemed fairly normal. Scott, a question from Joe Hardesty, who says, it seems like Aston Martin is having trouble yet again developing the car as the season goes on. Lance Stroll didn't make it out of Q2 and Alonso seemed lost for qualifying. What is it that's causing this issue? Are they lacking the correct personnel to develop the car as the season progresses, or is it similar to Mercedes in that they're having bad data and projections aren't correct?
It's difficult. I don't think it is bad data or projections or whatever, because I just don't think they could have done the job that they did at the start of 23 if that sort of stuff was kind of inherent in the way that they do things. But there is clearly something, isn't there, in how they then evolve a package. And I wonder if that's the issue, and if there's just a key difference there in terms of the amount of extra time that you have to sort of formulate that baseline when you actually put that initial concept together, evolve the initial concept and get that working, get that running on track. Let's say, 23 is the example, but also 24. You've got an on-track reference from what you're using at the time, but then you're also doing lots and lots of work in the background for several months, knowing that the end point for that is testing in February or whatever. And then also your first upgrades in the first month or so of the season are informed by that spell of development as well. But then once you get into the season, first of all, it's a lot more stressed and compressed in terms of timings. But second, you're into kind of iterative work, and it's that kind of those extra little bits of percentage rather than maybe the big or obvious gains, the low-hanging fruit that you get earlier in a process. So I wonder if it's something like that. The thing is, we don't know, and they don't know. If they knew, they would resolve it. The one thing I would say is that I was alluding to this earlier. While there's a faint air of what Aston struggled with before after one event, and obviously it wasn't a total disaster in terms of performance, I wouldn't write it off completely off the back of one race. I think we need a few more as a sample set.
Question I'll take from Paul Blart, who says, does the fact that Haas gave Behrman Magnussen's car for FP1 and not outgoing Hulkenberg's car a clear signal that Kevin is more likely not in their 2025 plans? I don't think that in itself was, but pretty much everything else is.
I think that's fair.
Yeah, I think Behrman will be in the car.
He will be there, but that's nothing to do with why he was in the car.
Exactly. He will be there next year, I'm almost certain, Behrman, and I don't think Magnussen will. There's a few drivers who could end up there. Bottas could end up there. It's possible Ocon could end up there. I think the driver market's changing literally by the minute at the moment in those few seats. Maybe we might see Valtteri Bottas if I had to have a guess right now, but it's really volatile, those few little seats with Bottas, Ocon, people like that, and Williams obviously chasing people. But yeah, I think Behrman will be in the car. Magnussen's probably on his way out, but they have to do one session, one FP1. Each driver gives up a session. They're giving 6 to Behrman as well, so he'll do more. But yeah, I don't think he'll always be in Magnussen's car. I think they'll swap around. Mark, a question from Gareth Moore, who says, what was the logic behind Mercedes pitting Russell and giving Hamilton the 6th place? Strange considering Russell's position in the team with Lewis leaving next season.
It was the root of that was Russell's much earlier stop. He stopped 7 laps earlier than Hamilton at the first stop. And he was running out of tyres, basically. He's running out of tyre tread. So they had to do it, really. He was going to be in real trouble by the end if they hadn't done so. Russell had a right to be irritated, but it was for being stopped so early the first time around. And I think that was just to try and break the stalemate where they were at that time, just sort of throwing the dice, really. So, yeah, I don't think it was designed to favour Hamilton rather than Russell. I don't think it was even designed to get the fastest lap. That was just a result of having to do the second stop.
Yeah, he was sort of careful to not complain too much after the race, but he did very much stress I was the stronger driver this weekend. But it also gave an extra point for Mercedes, didn't affect their net positions of 6th and 7th. Scott, a question from Jacobus VDL, who says, have VCard STR, that's one of the variations we haven't heard yet, brought some upgrades that have allowed Tsunoda to be so competitive this weekend? Or are there other reasons that he's been able to run as high in the free practice and quali sessions?
Well, actually, I think this team was the only one that didn't have an upgrade this weekend, wasn't it, Ed?
Yeah, the only one that didn't have anything at all. Some only had a few bits, and McLaren, for example, just had a couple of circuit-specific things, the rear wing and beam wing for this level, but RB, absolutely nothing.
So I think actually what this was a few things. One, it was probably better understanding and optimising the upgrades that they've brought in recent races. Second, it's probably that this circuit maybe lent into the strengths of those upgrades and the car itself a little bit more at times. And then the final thing is just Tsunoda himself. One, he's generally in very, very good form this season. And two, I think he likes this circuit and he's very, very quick here. Knows it quite well by now. So it was just a range of factors. I think that is definitely one of the better cars in the midfield. It's at the front for pretty much most races now this season. It has been at the head of that second group, nipping at Aston every now and again. Alonso, I think, even mentioned that RB is a potential threat to them if they don't make progress and slip into the midfield. So, yeah, that's just where this team is. It's just as Tsunoda, when he really nails it, it's like what Hülkenberg can do in a Haas. When you have a really good driver over one lap who's nice and comfortable in a car that's actually capable of being really fast when it's got soft tyres on and low fuel and some of the limitations are masked, that's where it can end up. Obviously, it regresses to the mean eventually, but it doesn't mean you can't have some fun until that happens.
And the final question I'll take from Ansi Ralmo, who says, why isn't Ricciardo considered an option for teams like Williams or Alpine? It seems weird that Ricciardo is usually portrayed as having binary choice between the best car on the grid or not being in F1 at all. Does Daniel himself feel like he doesn't want to continue in midfield machinery? He's not considered an option because, well, he isn't for them. Williams, Alpine, the others aren't interested in him particularly. And I think for Ricciardo, it pretty much is all or nothing. Either he makes his case for Red Bull, gets into a top car again, or he says it's not quite working, and it's leaning towards it. It's leaning towards not quite working. He's overall this season, he's been clearly the second best RB driver by a reasonable margin. I don't think Daniel will keep on endlessly in midfield machinery. I think this is the last roll of the dice.
And I think to the point about choosing between the best car on the grid or not being in F1 at all, I don't think it's quite so binary, but ultimately I believe Ricciardo is under contract. Red Bull has an option on him for 2025, so he's not an option to others because he's an option to Red Bull as well. That's another factor. So he'll either be in Red Bull Racing or in RB or be off the grid. That is more likely than not the scenario.
Yeah, that's very much the mechanics of it. Well, thanks to Scott and Mark as always, and thanks to everyone for their questions. There'll be loads to read on our website, plenty to watch on our YouTube channel, and hours to listen to across our many podcasts. So whatever your format of choice, the race has got you covered. As for us, it's straight to Monte Carlo next, so stay with us for everything you need to know about the Monaco Grand Prix.
The Athletic.